We're joined this week by Dr. George Annor, who has quite a long title, so give me a second here. The Assistant Professor, the General Mills Endowed
Oh,
Professor in
all
Cereal
right.
Chemistry and Technology at the University of Minnesota. Is that right?
I'm an associate professor now, actually.
Oh, so you got a promotion. I've got an outdated title.
Yes.
You are at the University of Minnesota. We appreciate the time. I met you during an event focused on Dr. George Washington Carver at Simpson College in Indianola, Iowa, and wanted to continue our conversation. You have a fascinating background, and so we appreciate the time.
Thank you.
I wonder first, one thing that strikes me talking to you is your background and what you experienced as a boy and how that drives you in so many aspects of your research. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about your upbringing in Ghana first and what you experienced there.
Thank you. So, as you mentioned, I'm George and I'm originally from Ghana. I actually grew up in a very normal family, normal in the sense that my parents were not that rich. So it's just a normal African family. I did my bachelor's education, my primary bachelor's and master's education at the University of Ghana. Now, what led me into what I do or food science basically was stem from the fact that my dad, who actually at some point wanted me to go to the medical school, had to convince me to go into food science and nutrition, partly because I did not make it into medical school. So I came home that day. I was very, very distraught and very sad. And my dad asked me about what the other options were. I said, well, I have biochemistry, I have zoology, botany, there's food science and nutrition. And he said, uh-huh, food science and nutrition. And then he looked at me and said, you should do food science. And I asked why. And he said, look at it this way, as long as people eat, you would always get a job. So that actually rang a bell in my head. And I would say that at that point, I had no idea what food science and nutrition was, but the idea of getting a stable job and making money in the future actually made me look into food science and nutrition. So I went into that, did food science and nutrition, and then came to the University of Guelph in Canada to do my PhD in food science. So I specifically specialized in cereal science and technology. So I usually will call myself a cereal scientist. But growing up in Ghana, there were a lot of things that really also gave me a lot of interest into agriculture or food processing. Now, most of these stem from the fact that there was a lot of food waste in our system. In a country like Ghana or in most developing countries, there's very little means to store food after it is harvested. So a lot of it goes to waste. So there was this idea about how do I correct or help mitigate this food waste system. We also have issues where yields from crops are just going down. Farmers have very unpredictable harvest because the weather keeps changing. There's a lot of rain, like literally too much rain, and sometimes there is virtually no rain. And so you have this cycle of rain and no rain where it was very difficult to actually predict what farmers would get or predict how much of the foods can even be processed and stored until it gets to consumers. So some of these things actually pique my interest into looking at food and how we can harvest food, but specifically how we can take food from the farm after it is harvested straight to the consumer. And that is what I do as a food scientist.
One of the things you talked about is primarily when you were young, a lot of the families there were almost solely focused on producing food to feed themselves. They weren't really thinking of, let's find a way to mass produce so that we can export, right? It was
Yeah.
basically how do we take care of ourselves? Now you've seen, and you go back every year because you still have family there, but you've seen how this is transformed. However, one of the fascinating things I thought about what you were talking about is primarily a lot of these families will take the best stuff they produce, they export that, and what they keep and feed themselves would almost be the rejects, the stuff that's not as good to export, right? What's that like?
Yeah, that is exactly right. So in most developing countries or in Ghana, I would say we don't really have farms. Um, I really got exposed to what a farm looked like when I think when I was flying into Canada or somewhere in the US, where you could see huge farmlands and green farmlands. In Ghana, it's more of small scale farming or backyard gardening, as we sometimes would call it. So families are more interested in what can I grow to feed myself and my family, and to some extent, the community where they live. Hardly do we have farmers who have the intention of buying very big masses of land to produce on a large scale because they can't afford it, and they can't afford the land in the first place. They can't afford the implements, and they can't afford the input. So it's all small scale farming. But yes, you are definitely right. In order to make some money, farmers would harvest crops from their fields and essentially sell the best ones to the market, send the best ones to the market so they can make an income and then keep the reject. We see this all the time. Even the fishermen who goes to sea, they come back, they would have to select the fish and sell the ones that are good and keep the ones that are not necessarily good to be sold. Ghana export a lot of pineapples and a lot of yam. So yam is a tuber like cassava. We export a lot of it to the US and to Europe. And this is exactly what happens. Farmers will select the best yams or the best pineapples because that is what meets all the strict requirement for the export market, and essentially keep the rest and just eat it for what it is. They can't store it as well. So some of these foods will actually go bad. And so in Ghana, eating fermented foods is actually a big thing
Hmm.
because when these products actually start going bad, some of them we don't really see it as spoiled. We just see it as they just fermented. It's just another type of food. And sometimes we eat it. So I eat a lot of fermented foods not because I like it, but I grew up with it. If you cannot store the food and it gets fermented, rather than throw it away, we find uses for them. We find ways to use them and therefore ultimately reduce how much food goes to waste. In Ghana, we eat pretty much everything. When we harvest an animal, we eat pretty much everything, including the offals and everything. It is not the same here. So it is sometimes it's a little I find it a little strange with how much food goes to waste just because maybe people just don't like them, or people just don't know what to do with some of the foods that are thrown away. But I think it is a huge problem, and it goes a long way in impacting the agricultural sector or the food industry because the food industry basically makes what consumers want. And if consumers don't like fermented foods, so be it. Hershey's make a chocolate that is actually slightly fermented, and this goes way back when they started making chocolate. They had to transport the cocoa beans from one place to the other, and they didn't have very good storage facilities. And so by the time the cocoa beans got to where it was supposed to be processed, it had fermented a bit. They used it anyway, and they realized that people actually became used to that fermented flavor in their chocolate. So they actually now intentionally ferment the chocolate just to get that flavor. So consumers will get what they have been eating all these years.
Wow. And you wonder some of this if this is almost just a cultural choice by Americans that are used to abundance while we still have substantial poverty in our country. We still have primarily been a country of food abundance, and
Yes.
it is just a different outlook on some of this. I wonder if can you talk a little bit about the research that you do at the University of Minnesota and how this plays into the farmland community when it comes to production? What types of things, what's your goal? What are you trying to accomplish with your research?
So, as a food scientist, we are interested in the processing piece of foods, but I still have very strong collaborations with breeders and with agronomists. So I still go into that field of food production. One of the things we do in my lab is to pretty much monitor the changes that happens in food products or in agricultural product, if I may use that word. A good example is wheat. I work a lot on wheat. We have a hard and we have a spring wheat breeder on campus here at the university. And what the breeding team does is, of course, to breed for increased protein, to breed for increased yield, to breed for pest resistance, and all those agronomic traits. But if you do all those things and you ultimately change that grain in a negative way, consumers won't be able, the food industry won't be able to use it for example, for baking bread or baking cookies. And consumers won't be able to enjoy the breads or the baked product that they are used to. So one of the things we do is to work with the breeders to screen all these wheat samples that they work on for their breeding and agronomic work and ensure that we keep tabs on how the grain is changing. Is it changing for the better? Is it remaining the same? Is it changing for the worse? And we provide that feedback to the breeding program to make sure that whatever they do does not negatively impact the grains. Another thing, one of the things we do is also, which is more tied to sustainability, is that my lab or my group, we are part of what we call the Forever Green Initiative. This is an initiative at the University of Minnesota, heavily sponsored by the state, of course, and the university. And the idea with the Forever Green Initiative is to develop sustainable crops. These are crops that we should be able to grow and still have some environmental benefits. I work on one crop called Kernza or intermediate wheatgrass. This Kernza is a perennial and is in actual fact the first perennial, commercially available perennial grain, as far as I know. Kernza came into the US, I think, in the 80s, and it was used as for feeding animals. But we realized that you can actually use this Kernza and you can actually grow this Kernza as a cover crop. So it covers the field so that you don't have a lot of soil erosion. The crop also has very, very deep root systems, huge root systems. And of course, that also keeps soils intact. And also because the root is so deep, it is able to better utilize all the fertilizer runoffs that comes from our farms. I mean, we can't run away from the fact that we use a lot of fertilizer and in most cases too much in my view. And these would leach into the soil. And for a state like Minnesota, where we cherish our underground water, we cherish our underground water bodies, that is a big, big deal for us. So the state is actually funding a lot of work where we are actually figuring out a way to have this Kernza on the field to protect the environment, but also find uses for the grains that are harvested. Because it's a perennial, you can harvest it for multiple years. As far as I know, you can harvest it for about 4 years until the yield really tanks. But myself as a food scientist and my group are trying to figure out what we can do with the grain. Can we bake with the grain? Can we make alcoholic beverages, for instance, beer with the grain? Can we ferment the grain? The grain has a lot of dietary fiber. which is good for our health. The idea of creating products and also looking at the quality of the grain has the aim of trying to increase a demand for the grain, which would hopefully encourage farmers to grow the crop, make some money, but also protect the soil and the environment.
Where would, as you look at the United States, where do you see this doing best geographically?
So Kernza is actually a cool season crop. So it is grown a lot in Minnesota. So the
Sure.
furthest we go down south, I think, is Kansas, and Kansas because actually the Land Institute that actually started this whole idea of developing Kernza for domesticating Kernza for agricultural use is located in Kansas, so they grow some of it there. But generally, it is in Minnesota, in all the cool places that we have up north.
As you look at this and listening to what you're talking about, is this is this the future as we look toward sustainability, better protecting and respecting the environment so that we can start thinking long term about this? Is genetically enhancing these crops, the in theory this will be our alternative to relying so much on fertilizers and pesticides and all those additional input costs. So big picture, does this get us a way where it's somehow environmentally better and it may be financially more sustainable for producers as well because they're not then dealing with all of those increased input costs? Is that the panacea? Is that possible?
Yeah, I think it's possible, and I know there is a lot of issues when it comes to genetically modified foods, but
Sure.
in my view, I don't think it is something we can do away with. I mean, genetic modifications happens in nature. So and when it happens in nature, we consider it as okay. But when we do it in the lab, sometimes, of course, it has issues. There are issues about taking something from one plant, a gene from one plant, and putting it into another plant. But the rate at which we are losing resources, coupled with the rate at which the population of the world is increasing, I think we can still leverage the use of genetic modification for improving the crops that we grow. At least here at the University of Minnesota, I know at least for the wheat breeding program, they don't actually use the like what we call genetic modification. They still use conventional breeding, which takes a much longer time. So it will take about 5 to 10 years probably to develop a crop and even more. But with the help of genetic modification or the help of genetics, you can shorten that time. With the way things are going with climate change and scarcity of land, and just not scarcity, but the land that is available is not even suitable for some of the crops that we grow now. It will be important to now look at developing crops that can still use the little that is left, right? It will be good to develop crops that probably can use less water than they currently use. To be good to develop crops that will use less fertilizer or less input, so we don't have farmers having to use more than they actually need. So I think it is one of the ways. It's not the only way, but it will obviously help in trying to improve the current predicament we have when it comes to sustainability in agriculture.
You talked about one of the things involved in your research is to try to increase the amount of protein. And it seems like in so many diets, so many healthy plans really, and then from the economical side, I suppose as well, we're looking for more protein sources. How challenging is that to try to take an existing crop and figure out how to up its protein?
So increase for protein is demand for protein is actually increasing. Consumers are consistently looking for high protein. Of course, we know why proteins are good for us. So it has become a trend now where everybody is now looking for high protein diets. So yes, one of the ways would be to genetically increase the protein content of a crop. But some of the things that is being done now is to try and extract the protein from, say, soy or pea and use that protein for food application. So now you have on the market, you probably can find beverages that have 40 grams of protein or 20 grams of protein. These are actually coming from protein that has been extracted from plants. So that is the plant side. And we also have researchers who are looking at insects as a source of protein, right? I mean, it is not just grabbing an insect nearby and just putting it in your mouth, but we are actually looking at people establishing insect farms where they can actually grow insects. So there are farms where you can actually have crickets being grown just like a farm. So that is something that would actually help. Insects are very efficient in turning energy into food. Sorry, into turning a food into energy and therefore storing that energy as a source of food. The proteins from insect are also very good. So when I say good, I mean the quality of the protein in terms of what we call the amino acid profile. Plant proteins usually don't have a very good quality as compared to animal proteins. So egg is considered the best protein because it has all the essential amino acids that we need and in their right quantities. You don't seem to find that a lot in plant protein, so that is a limiting factor there. But I know there are companies or there are people who are looking at enhancing that protein quality in some of these crops using breeding techniques. But insect protein is one. There is now all this talk about lab-grown proteins, where you essentially would take a single cell, pretty much like microbes. I will use yeast as an example. So yeast actually can be cultivated, and that those yeast cells can be harvested and used as a source of protein. So that is one piece. Scientists can also get what we call a cell line. So they can get a cell line that pretty much can be cultivated into something that looks like actual, like beef. So these are being done. Some of these are still at the very early stages of research, but these are some of the things that researchers are doing to help meet this very increasing demand for protein. Now, it is important to note that when you take proteins from, say from a cow or beef, we all know how much input and how much energy and all the work that has to go into grow a cow and harvest it and get it onto
The
the
table.
onto the table. And to some people, it is actually too much inputs that go into such a process. So there are people who are actually advocating for us to consume the grains that we grow. Most of the grains that we grow actually goes into feeding animals and obviously getting the meat at the end. But there are people who are saying, why don't we eat these grains ourselves and essentially reduce how much waste we have in the system when we feed these animals with the grains and now harvest these animals for meat. So these are some of the things that are actually going on in that regard.
So, as you look forward, is that where more of the potential is? That lab based production and then maybe enhanced plant production? Or is that fair to say that that's where you see maybe the most developments happening, and that's our best bet to grow the kind of food in a way we want to grow it for the future?
Yeah, yes, I think we should. I would say that obviously there's a lot of interest in some of these lab grown meats. There's a lot of interest in some of these plant proteins, or there's also a lot of interest in what we call so not necessarily just the plant protein, but if you take a company like what's the name of the company that makes the burgers in California?
Oh,
Impossible Burger. Yeah.
mhm.
So the people, I mean, when this whole thing started, people actually became interested. So I can eat something that looks like a burger, but not necessarily come from
Mhm.
plants, come from animals. For me, if you're a vegan, it's perfect. There are challenges with extracting that protein and making it taste like what meat
And the
tastes
consistency of it,
and
right?
the consistency, but I know there's a lot of work that is going on in that area. I think there is still a future for these kinds of products. It will take substantial investment and a lot of time. And I say this because ultimately it is very difficult to change food habits. People eat a certain kind of food, and now to introduce a new product takes a while for people to get used to that product. But yes, developing these high protein diets, improving the plants we have to be able to use whatever little resources we have, I see as one of the ways to reduce or combat this issue of uh, slowing agricultural production and all the challenges that we actually have in the agricultural sector.
And to be open here, you are not pushing for folks to quit eating meat.
No,
You are a meat consumer
no,
yourself.
I am
Uh,
a meat
so
consumer, and I'm not pushing for people to stop eating meat. I just think it is an alternative. That's why we actually call it a meat alternative. It
alternative.
is not supposed to be a meat replacement. So yes, if you can eat meat, you can eat it, but this is an alternative for people who for some reason cannot eat meat because the nutritional profile for these different classes of proteins, like animal protein versus plant protein, are very different. In most cases, the animal proteins are superior than the plant protein. So there are pros and cons, but yes, it is just an alternative product.
You have some people who are skeptical, just frankly, when they hear the concept of lab produced meat, if you will. How do you assure people, and I appreciate that this is not specifically your emphasis, but when you're talking about creating something like this, how do we as consumers have the comfortability that this is safe and this is healthy and okay for us to consume?
Well, the one thing I would say is that as a consumer, always pay attention to your nutritional label on the product. It is important you understand what has gone into making whatever food you buy. So when we're making all these plant products, there's a lot of, I don't want to use the word chemicals, but there's a lot of additives that we add just to make it taste like and look like meat. For some people, it could be a turn-off with all the names and with all those chemicals, but from a food science perspective, sometimes those are needed for preservation, for food safety, to make sure the product stays longer and actually maintains its freshness. So yes, it is okay if consumers become a little wary. I am not all into these plant protein foods myself. It is going to take me a while to get used to the idea of eating a burger that is not really coming from an animal or coming from meat. So I would say it will take time for consumers to get used to it. And I would say that in most cases, these companies make sure that the foods that they are making are safe. There are regulations in the state. You have to make sure under the FDA regulations, you don't sell any food that would harm any consumer. So I know with all the chemicals, with all the additives that are added to these foods, they are usually added according to what is usually prescribed by the FDA. That is not to say everybody is doing all the right things. I can't speak for any company, but I would say generally we, as food scientists, we try to make foods that are safe that are also appealing, that are also palatable. I would say sometimes the use of certain words like lab-grown meat can be a little
Doesn't
scary
help.
for
Right.
consumers. Like, oh, my meat was grown in a lab. Yes, that is problem. We may have to come up with a better way to describe these products. Uh, but I would say when we extract proteins from peas or soy and use it for product, we don't necessarily call those ones as lab-grown meat. The lab-grown ones are the ones that you take as a cell line, and increase the number of those cell lines, and you harvest it and you use it as a source of protein. So yeah, lab-grown meat, I think, would need to change at some point to encourage people to actually start eating some of these products.
We appreciate the wide ranging conversation. I wonder if I can end with one more request from you. If I know you go back home every year to visit family back in Ghana. If you are leading an American on a tour, or you really want to show an American who has never been to Ghana
Mm.
something, what do you like to show off when you go back home?
A lot. One will be the food. We have a myriad of foods that are really, really, really good, but
Uh,
they're
Goat,
spicy.
right?
Yes, so yeah, but the foods are very spicy.
Hmm.
We eat a lot of meat as well. Goat meat is one of the meat that is kind of like a delicacy in Ghana. I've been looking for goat meat everywhere here, and it's very difficult to find some here. But yes, the food is great. But one thing that attracts a lot of people to Ghana is the fact that Ghana was one of the countries where a lot of slavery took place. So we have monuments, we have a very rich history about what happened, even though what happened wasn't good and nice, we still have been able to preserve those stories and those monuments. And so I know we've had a couple of US presidents visit Ghana. I know Obama and Michelle were in Ghana. And I know George Bush Jr. was also in Ghana just to see this monument and pretty much be told what really happened. Some of them are disheartening, but I think it really gives you some insights into what really happened and what has made some of us who we are. Because when I was first exposed to the story, I really felt bad. But on the flip side, I looked at it this way that, well, now I think it gives me the opportunity to prove myself that in the past, some of us were looked down upon as slaves, but now we can do pretty much what anybody can do. Like I see myself sitting here talking to you right now, and I'm an associate professor at the University of Minnesota. I mean, I was a very normal kid growing in Ghana. I had no idea where I would be in the future. And if somebody had told me at that time that I would be sitting here in Minnesota as an associate professor, I would have said, no way. But all those challenges that you are exposed with, I'm sure the slaves were exposed to that, all the challenges that we go through make us who we are. I am who I am because of all the things that I've gone through growing up in Ghana. And a lot of the things I learned as a kid growing up in Ghana are still with me, even though I've lived here in the US for a couple of years. I still have those things in me. So seeing those monuments, I think are really, really great. In the in Ghana, we have, like in the US, we have states. In Ghana, we have regions. So we used to have 10, I think now it's 12, but there is a particular region called the Ashanti region. It is the region is the home of what we call the Ashanti Kingdom. The Ashanti Kingdom is, well, used to be one of the most powerful kingdoms in Ghana. It still is. They have a very rich culture. Ashanti region has a lot of gold. Ghana used to be called Gold Coast because we have a lot of gold. And the Ashanti Kingdom is one of those kingdoms where they showcase the treasures that Ghana has. They have very beautiful clothing. They show if the Ashanti king dresses up, he has so much gold on him that somebody literally has to hold his hand because the gold monuments that he has are so heavy. It is really fascinating to see some of these things when you visit a place like Ghana. And I would say people should really have it on their bucket list to visit Ghana. Food is great, really nice place. The people are nice. People are happy and smiling, even though things are not always good. People tell me you're always happy. I said, yes, I have to be happy. Growing up, if you think about all the issues and the problems that you encounter every day, you're going to be sad. But irrespective of all that, we still make a way. We still smile over a lot of things, and that helps you to go over some of the problems that we face in Ghana.
Well, thank you for your smile and thank you for your commitment to our future in this country and beyond. Very much appreciate the time today. Thank
You're
you.
welcome. You're welcome.